Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have quorum.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone today. I'm Trustee Dan McLean, Chair of the Finance, Budget, and Enrollment Committee. Today is Wednesday, March 26th, and I'd like to call this meeting to order and welcome committee members, trustees, staff, and members of the public. At this time, I ask all those who are able to please rise for the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas, of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Miigwech. The next item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. We've had a request to move 6.2 to follow 5.2 and be before 5.3. Does anybody have any objections to that?
Chair, no, it's Trustee Earhart. No objections to that, but wondering if we could also move the other motion proposed for discussion to go alongside it, which Trustee DeVitis, I understand, is seconding. Thank you.
Trustee DeVitis has to leave. Hopefully we can do them quickly. Does anybody have any objection to moving 6.1 and 6.2 to follow 5.2? Can I get a mover and a seconder to approve the agenda as modified?
I can move, Chair. Trustee Earhart.
Trustee Earhart and Trustee Hassan will second. All in favor, do a show of hands. Opposed? Aye. So that passes. Thank you. Trustees have had an opportunity to review the agenda and the recommendations. Do any trustees have any declarations of possible conflict of interest? Hearing and seeing none, we will move forward. We will now move to item 4, which is delegations. Delegations allow for the public to address committees of the board and are designed to ensure that members of the public can provide information and perspectives to trustees as we navigate the decision-making process. Delegates are reminded that they are to provide input in a respectful and constructive manner and should not engage in any behavior contrary to the board's code of conduct, human rights policy, or delegation policy. We have 4 delegates tonight. You will have 5 minutes to present your delegation. You will hear a ring, a bell, when you're approaching the end of your time. We ask you to please stay on the line or to stay at the table, because trustees may have questions of clarification following your delegation as well. And trustees have 3 minutes to do that. So our first delegate is Michael Scheel. He's a TDSB parent, and he's online. We do? Mr. Scheel, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
We can. It's a little, if you can try to get a little closer to your speaker, that would be helpful, but please proceed, sir.
Okay, I can get this a little bit closer for you. Okay, thank you for letting me present. My name is Michael Scheel. I'm a parent of a grade 9 student with mild cognitive challenges who's in grade 9 at Hayden Park Secondary School. I'm also on the parent council. I wanted to present today about the students that we found out at our recent parent council meeting, where students will no longer be placed by the TDSB and the MID program at Hayden Park starting next year, with a large negative impact we feel that this has on the quality of education and supports at the school, a massive negative impact on students there, like my daughter, and the impact on the community. I just have 3 or 4 points to make here. Hayden Park is the only all-girls school in the TDSB offering a dedicated MID program alongside an academic stream. That academic stream supports kids who aren't identified with MID needs, but still have some cognitive, social challenges and disabilities and need some special supports that they can't get in the regular school. My daughter, Lily, is one of those kids in the academic stream who requires some specific supports, funding supports, and social supports that's not offered by the other schools in the TDSB, and flounders in the other sort of environments Hayden Park is a safe, supportive environment for young women, transgender, non-binary students who might otherwise struggle in the large schools. And evidence-based research consistently shows that children with cognitive and social challenges do comparatively better in single-gender or gender-based educational settings like Hayden Park, particularly around feeling safety and trust, social supports, improved teacher-student relationships, and in the end, higher academic achievement. My own daughter is a testament to that. I think without the MID program, vulnerable students are going to be forced into schools that may not meet their needs. A second point is that the funding for MID students brings other benefits to the other students at Hayden Park. And I know that MID students can get streamed to other MID programs elsewhere, and there's challenges with that, but this is a bigger impact on only other students. Because when there's support for an MID program, funding follows for several things that are important for all the kids at Hayden Park. They get funding for, they can do the essentials levels class, they get supports like social supports, psychological supports through specialized support staff. They're able to deliver smaller class sizes, access to technology supports, improve social relationships, resources to improve mental health, and just all the technical supports and the academic supports that you get with the MID program that are used and for the academic program too. Without these supports, the students can't really learn properly, and frankly, they fail classes. One of my daughter's science teacher pointed out that 19 of the 24 kids in his class, now that he's forced to not teach the essentials course in science, he has to teach the usual university prep course, level course, their standard one, and most of the kids are failing because he's not allowed to be able to do it with the way that you need for kids with these cognitive challenges. My third point is there's growing demand for specialized education in Toronto. 20%, and these stats I'm about to say are from Stats Canada. 20% of Canadian youth aged 15 to 24 report having a disability last year. That's a 54% increase in just 5 years. That rate's going to triple in Toronto by 2035. I feel like cutting the MID placements and scrunching them into different other schools kind of contradicts the growing need for more, not fewer, specialized programs, particularly in this area of the province. We know, my next point is we know that there's specialized schools improve educational and life outcomes for students like my daughter. Evidence-based studies consistently show that specialized MID programs, when mixed with supportive academic streams, just like at Hayden Park, dramatically increase graduation rates from something like 65.5% to over 95% success. It's from different case studies across North America. Well-supported specialized programs are significantly more likely to secure stable employment and pursue post-secondary education afterwards. Now, as my daughter's science teacher points out, that's because, well, they can pass the classes and they can understand and get support so they can learn the information, be able to apply it afterwards and be able to get jobs. Otherwise, many of them are going to fail those classes that they need to be able to get their high school certification. So I just feel like, and on behalf of the Parent Council, we just feel like if MID placements are restricted at Hayden Park, we think that vulnerable students are going to be forced into unsuitable environments. It's going to increase the dropout rates. It's going to increase failure rates for those students. It's going to increase socialization and behavioral challenges as well. And so we're just requesting that the TSB maintain MID placements at Hayden Park. That is under 5 minutes, and that is everything I wanted to say.
Thank you, sir. We ask you to hold on a second just to confirm that we don't have any questions of clarification. Trustee Williams?
Thank you, and through the chair, thank you so much for your delegation, Mr. Gilles. And through the chair, my question is a question of clarification with regard to the specific supports and school environment you described in your delegation. Why Hayden Park? Why Hayden Park in particular supports MID students and in particular women and girls?
Sure. I can tell you from experience, my daughter was identified. I'll make this quick. I'm not going to make a long rambling story. I'll tell you from personal experience. My daughter was identified by SickKids back when she was in grade 3 that she needed these supports. When she doesn't have them, when she's in a regular class at a regular school where you get pulled out, which is the way that this works, you get pulled out and get extra attention now and then. if the information is too difficult, too heavy, other kids notice that she doesn't do well, other kids will pick on her, and she can get bullied for that. And there are no other schools in the TDSB that allow for that. And it's when you have cognitive challenges, there are also the social challenges that come along too, because you don't quite get along with the other kids and the other kids don't quite get along with you. And this is even worse if you're gender-based and you're non-binary, and you also have that, loading on top of that as well. And so having a school where you feel safe and supportive like that, it's easier for you to open up and learn. The kids point out that my daughter, when she was feeling safe and secure, is somewhere around the 72nd percentile in learning. When she doesn't feel safe and secure, she's somewhere around the 5th percentile. And if she doesn't get those support, and the science teacher was quite upfront, if she doesn't get those supports, she's going to fail science. And then next year, when the supports for math and for chemistry get taken away too, because the MID program gets taken away, and she's going to have to learn the regular standard course for that. And her brain isn't made up for that. And she's in she's in the top bracket at Hayden Park. So there's a hell of a lot more kids that are going to be worse off. And so with that NID funding comes the support that they're able to actually hire staff who have those specialized skills, who can, yes, work with the MID program, but also support the non-MID program. And that's the part that scares me the most. Does that answer your question?
Through the chair, thank you for that clarification and just bringing home the point, the importance of the program there at Hayden Park. Through the chair, that was my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Williams. Thank you, Mr. Shield. Thank you very much for your delegation.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Next up, we have Kelly Eggers. It's a TDSB teacher librarian. Welcome, and please proceed.
My name is Kelly Eggers. I'm a TDSB parent, community member, and teacher librarian at I would like to speak to you today.
Sorry, I apologize for interrupting. I'm not sure that's working. And sorry, we apologize for the inconvenience. Invite you to start again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Kelly Eggers. I'm a TDSB parent, a community member, and the teacher librarian at Annette Street Public School. I would like to speak to you today about the importance of teacher librarians in our schools. On March 4th, board staff recommended a decrease of 8 elementary teacher librarian positions for the coming year. This may not seem like a lot, but it is significant. Even in our board, which I know values libraries, school libraries have faced compounding cuts over the years. School library staffing has been reduced from the days before my time of full-time teacher librarians plus clerical staff in every school, to half-time teacher librarians with libraries shuttered for 50% of the day, to most recently, many library allocations that fall below half-time and are now at risk of further cuts. And yet, in the changing landscape of the world for which we are preparing our students, libraries are as important as ever. When we zoom in on the frightening moment in history where we find ourselves right now, libraries may be more important than they have ever been before. We find ourselves at a time when social media and tech giants are removing fact-checking and hate speech protections from their platforms. Some governments are inventing facts to suit their purposes. Children are encountering fake news and misinformation from a younger and younger age. And young people spend a greater amount of time than ever before navigating frightening influences online. Cutting teacher librarians means removing the very people who specialize in helping students develop critical digital literacy skills, the skills they need to navigate the online world, evaluate the credibility of information, and formulate their own viewpoints. We are also witnessing the slashing of efforts to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, with some jurisdictions attempting to erase the validity of identity by decreeing that references to race, gender, ethnicity, religion, and other aspects of identity have no place in the classroom. Our libraries, often more than any other space in a school, affirm students' identities through access to culturally relevant and responsive resources. They provide students with mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, resources that reflect back to them the validity of their own identity, provide a view into the lives and identities of others, and build understanding of lived experiences unlike their own. Cuts to library staffing would restrict the ability of our libraries to provide these brave, safe spaces at a time when they are absolutely essential. The prospect of cuts to libraries is especially chilling in the context I just described. But the importance of teacher librarians extends beyond the current context. They are key to supporting the board's multi-year strategic plan with its commitments to equity, truth and reconciliation, and ensuring that every student belongs, achieves, and thrives. Libraries are vibrant hubs in our schools that create community and connection. School libraries, through the work of teacher librarians, offer spaces of belonging that center and amplify underrepresented voices, perspectives, and identities. They provide equitable access to resources, technology, and learning opportunities. They provide opportunities for students to develop skills in STEM, digital literacy, research and inquiry, critical thinking, collaboration, and communication. They center Indigenous perspectives, histories, cultures, and contemporary experiences. And teacher librarians provide support and collaborative leadership to teaching staff seeking to embed Indigenous perspectives in their classrooms. And they measurably improve student achievement. Decades of research from Ontario and internationally shows that students with access to school libraries staffed by qualified teacher librarians perform better academically. These benefits hold true regardless of social and economic factors and are in some cases greatest for the most marginalized students, including racialized students, low-income students, and students with disabilities. But libraries do not work by simply existing. A library that is not staffed by an educator or that is only minimally staffed by an educator cannot make these impacts. Please preserve these brave spaces in our schools. Please maintain, or better yet, increase the allocation for teacher librarians in every elementary and secondary school. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Igers. I'm going to pause briefly to see if we have any. Trustee King?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Through you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Igers. I always appreciate your advocacy, and I know how much the library space at Annette is appreciated. I have a question. When the allocations for teacher librarians were presented to us, we saw as well the reduction in 8 full-time equivalent positions, but we heard through staff, as you explained, that it's not necessarily 8 librarians in 8 different schools being reduced, but rather multiple smaller reductions. I'm not going to, I don't recall the exact numbers shared, but I know that we're talking about reductions lower than 0.5, for example, from 0.3 to 0.2. And when you speak about the concern about the impacts of those cuts, I'm wondering if you can help clarify on a practical level, what is an example of something that is done or not done based on a reduction of example from point 3 to point 2? What does that mean in your role isn't happening?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So reductions like that, while they may sound small, they make a huge impact in terms of the library program that a TL, a teacher librarian, can actually provide. As it is, I think any teacher librarian would agree that every school should, in an ideal, properly funded education system, have a full-time librarian. Instead, we have generally a 0.5 or a 0.39 allocation in most of our schools. And that means that the librarian is constantly balancing many different roles that pull them in many different directions and often pull them to many different parts of a building. And so the way that can look in practice is that, like I mentioned, a library might be shuttered for half of the day. A teacher librarian who is reduced even further, like as you said, maybe to a 0.2 allocation, what that translates to is essentially a couple of periods a day, a fraction of, 0.2 would be less than a quarter of the time. So it might be less than a quarter day each day that the library is accessible. And our teacher librarians are responsible, or the hope is that they're delivering programming that enriches the education for maybe 500 students in a building. In my building, 700 students, and maybe 30 different staff members where they're the collaborative partner. So being limited to 2 periods a day to enrich the learning of 500 students, manage a space of 10,000 to 20,000 books, promote a culture of reading in a building, try to create a space that's a flexible hub for learning and community and connection, those things just become impossible, and we lose so many of the potentially really incredible impacts of libraries.
Through the chair, thank you for helping us understand that. Nothing further from me.
Thank you, Trustee King. You're doing exceptionally well with the clock. Just
Right, I noticed that right on the second.
Do we have any other questions? No. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And before we get to the next delegation, which is Ms. Birch Jones from Dixon Grove, I am going to take a moment to been a little remiss in my duties. I'm going to take this opportunity on behalf of the Board of Trustees, on behalf of staff, to welcome Trustee Klein in her new role, and she's with us in person today. So we welcome you, and we look forward to your contribution and working in collaboration with you. Welcome. Ms. Birch Jones. She's a teacher, a librarian at Dixon Grove Junior Middle School, and she's also representing the Ontario School Library Association.
Good afternoon. My name is Wendy Birch Jones. I am a teacher librarian at Dixon Grove Middle School. I am a TL mentor leader. I am a year 1 digital lead learner, and I am, in fact, the president of the Ontario School Library Association. Thank you for that. Almost exactly 2 years ago today in this room, I came to address this committee with a colleague to express our gratitude. At that time, the board, in its wisdom, had continued to see the value in school libraries and the role of teacher librarians in restoring an allocation of 221.5 full-time equivalent teacher librarians in the budget of the day. At that time, you sent a clear message across the system that our role is important to the success of our school communities and the critical role we play in student learning. But there had also been a big change in the way that TL allocations were distributed. The glimmer of hope in this new formulaic approach to TL allocations at the elementary level took into account projected enrollment, weighted multilingual learner populations, and the Learning Opportunity Index. Schools will get either a 0.039, 0.051 allocation, and a sparse few, a 1.0 allocation. This was intended to be more equitable. And while the overall impact of reducing library allocations was difficult for many schools that had their allocations reduced, there was a sliver of hope in knowing that this approach recognized the diverse needs across our school communities. For example, where I work at Dixon Grove, we were amazed and thoroughly delighted to discover that our K-8 MISC school with a population of multilingual learners was one of only 8 that had been given a 1.0 TL allocation. I am not ashamed to tell you that my principal at the time and I did quite the happy dance after we picked our jaws up off the floor. However, as the staffing process unfolded, my delight was quickly diminished. When I got my timetable, I was devastated to see that I had only 10 periods of library. How did this happen? How did a 1.0 library allocation get reduced to me having 2/3 of my day in classrooms doing ELL and spec ed resource support? The answer is simple. We are working in a chronically underfunded system. In my role as the president of the Ontario School Library Association, I have listened to my school library professionals from across this province share stories about cuts to library staffing and programming in their boards. Teacher librarians, including those in our own board, continue to be concerned about ongoing reductions to library staffing and the subsequent impact on library programming. I have often referred to this as death by 1,000 cuts. In most boards, including this one, trustees like yourselves are asked to make impossible decisions with reduced budgets and competing interests. And at stake are our school libraries. Over the past 2 decades, hundreds of thousands of students across Ontario have lost access to their school libraries. Studies have shown a sharp decline in students who express the joy of reading. 76% expressed that in 1997. It was down to 47% in 2008, just over 20 years later. Not surprisingly, the impact of the pandemic accelerated this alarming trend with direct impacts on student literacy and success. My colleagues, of course, will know that this closely aligns with the declining presence of teacher librarians in Ontario schools over the same period. This downward trend is not only alarming, but also truly saddening, as the love of reading not only has a positive impact on literacy scores, but also bolsters success in core curriculum areas and student social and civic engagement. Teacher librarians are literacy and technology experts and lead learning in their whole school communities. We are highly trained with additional qualifications that are often at the forefront of digital and information literacy, growing global competencies, promoting critical thinking, and empowering students to deal with misinformation. The current TDSB budget projections have elementary TLs at only 213.5 full-time equivalent positions, representing a cut, as Kelly said, of 8 positions. As such, I am strongly advocating for a restoration back to 221.5 in this budget. Also, I'll say again, the role must be sweatered, as is the case with other specialist positions that also require additional qualifications. This will honor the value of the school library program that the board has confirmed as a priority in precedent decisions to provide additional funding beyond the ministry allocation. It'll ensure that library programs and TL instructional practices can continue to transform student learning, create a culture of well-being, and provide equitable access to learning opportunities and resources. One of the privileges of my role as president of OSLA has been to travel across the province and country to advocate for school libraries. Over and over again, I've heard how envious others are of the support that TLs have in the TDSB, both from within our incredible TL network and from the board itself. The legacy that you have created in continued funding for TL allocation in both panels speaks volumes. We know you recognize a strong library program can be the beating heart of a school community and provide the foundational literacy skills our students need across all curriculum areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Trustee Laskin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Forgive me for asking this question, but can you clarify how long you've been a librarian with the TDSB?
I have been a teacher librarian with the TDSB for, I believe, 7 or 8 years now.
Okay, so you weren't here between 2020 and 2014 when Trustee Atkinson was on the board?
I was? No, let me think.
No.
2014? No, that would have been prior to my time then.
Okay, thank you very much, because I'm under the impression, and I've asked staff to follow up, is I remember Trustee Atkinson making a motion at board that elementary schools would have a minimum 0.5 librarian. And I've Googled it, and I have found that we mandated every elementary school has at least a 0.5 teacher librarian. So I will be following up with staff. I just wondered if you had the recollection of that memory.
I do remember when there was a time that every school had a 0.5 teacher librarian.
Do you remember that?
My colleague who's about to do that does, absolutely. And I do remember before that when every school did have a 0.5 teacher librarian. 2 years ago, the formula was changed for how teacher librarians.
I understand that our formula has been changed over the years.
Yeah.
I'm just not clear, and I will follow up with staff in terms of if it was a board motion, what that means in terms of allocation. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Trustee Laskin. Do we have anybody else online? Hearing and seeing none, we thank you, Ms. Bridge-Jones, for your delegation. And now that leaves us with our last delegation for this afternoon, Kim Davidson from Milliken Public School. Please proceed when you're ready.
Good afternoon, committee members, board trustees, and other meeting attendees. My name is Kim Davidson, and I'm currently in my 25th year of teaching with the Toronto District School Board. And I'm proud to tell you that I've held the role of elementary school teacher librarian for 17 of those years in 5 different schools throughout the east end of the city. I'm also a teacher librarian network facilitator, helping to mentor and support TL system-wide. And I'm here today, as I have been before, as a passionate advocate for the importance of teacher librarians in our schools. Properly staffed and funded libraries lie at the heart of effective and welcoming schools in the Toronto District School Board. I believe that you know this. And yet I can tell you, based on not just my own personal experience, but the stories I've heard from TLs across the TDSB, the school library program is slowly eroding away through years of funding cuts and reduced staffing to the point that we are now approaching a critical point of consideration. The decisions and recommendations you make as a board could have dire consequences for library programs in schools system-wide. At first glance, cutting 8 TL positions from the system may not seem like that big a deal. While it is not certain what that reduction would look like at the school level, the proposed cut could result in a TL allocation reduction from 0.5 to 0.39 in 73 additional schools. I think these were the numbers that Trustee King was looking for earlier. Now, 0.11 of an allocation might not seem like a lot, but when you recalculate it in terms of teaching minutes per 5-day cycle, that works out to 165 minutes a week. To restate it a little bit more plainly, this proposed reduction in the TL allocation from 0.5 to 0.39 could mean a 22% reduction in teacher librarian staffing in 73 schools next year. Okay, so that's 73 schools in a system of hundreds. That's a drop in the bucket, right? I'm here to tell you the teacher librarian allocation has been quietly under attack for years. In a system that is chronically facing the pressures of an inadequate provincial funding model, there are many factors at play that can restrict the potential of our schools to have rich library programs. For example, when the planning department provides staffing allocations to school every spring, the number of teachers provided to schools is often not a whole number, and that has to be rounded up or down from the calculated value determined by whatever algorithm they use. Using my current school as an example, this year we were calculating an allocation of 18.22 classroom and support teachers in order to meet the instructional needs of our students, as well as deliver prep time. But because there is no such thing as a 0.22 teaching assignment, in reality, that number gets rounded down and the school receives a staff allocation of 18. But wait, what happened to that 0.22? It's got to be taken from somewhere. But where? Sad reality is, and we hear this over and over again from teacher librarians system-wide, is that the common practice is to carve that time out of the teacher librarian schedule. Teacher librarians are increasingly taking on teaching responsibilities that fall outside of the library allocation for prep delivery and other program delivery models. So imagine a teacher librarian with an allocation that has just been reduced to 0.39 and now could potentially also have to cover a shortfall of 0.22 due to a rounding error. That TL could possibly only have 0.19 of a schedule. That's 285 minutes a week available to devote to a library program. That school's library is now unstaffed over 80% of the day. Now, that's a worst case scenario. And I wish I could tell you that that's a massive exaggeration of the problem, but it's not. This is a story that we've heard too many times not to at least bring it to your attention. We don't expect this committee to be able to solve all of the timetabling pressures, but we do ask for your at least awareness that the allocation provided to TLs on paper is not often the allocation that translates into timetabling reality. And that means when further cuts are made to library staffing allocation, they are cuts to a role that is already fragile and stretched paper thin. We are seriously at risk of seeing the teacher librarian position disappear completely from some of our schools, if not on paper, then in reality, which is an outcome that I am confident that no one here wants to see happen. My ask for you on behalf of TLs across our board is that you please maintain or even increase teacher librarian allocation. In terms of value for money, you can't do much better than the work of teacher librarians. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Davidson. Do we have any questions online? Down in the room. Thank you very much for your delegation. And with that, that concludes the delegation process. We will move to staff reports. We will begin with 5.1, which is contract awards and operations, which is on page 1 of the agenda. And with that, I'm going to ask Director Latouche. But before we do that, can I also ask, because the next two items are very much related to the tariff challenges and the purchasing challenges that are present between with the province of Ontario, with the country of the Canadian and American. If we could just briefly touch on how those relate to our purchasing, I think it would be beneficial for the committee.
Thank you, Chair. And through you, I'm going to pass to Associate Director Zucker to make some introductory comments, and she will also bring in Craig Snyder.
Thank you, and through the Chair. Firstly, we know that there may be impacts of tariffs on the budget and the cost of goods that we are purchasing, depending on where the raw materials are coming from and how companies choose to deal with those situations. With regards to where and how we purchase, we are guided by our policy, and we are guided by which takes direction from the broader public sector procurement guidelines. Those guidelines already have in it for under $121,200. Those guidelines say that boards or the province, and boards would be included, should be prioritizing purchasing within Ontario. So that's already part of our guidelines. It's already part of everything that we do currently. In addition, for goods that are procured that are over that amount, the broader public sector procurement guidelines say we have to follow trade agreements. But when the goods are not impacted by the trade agreements, we are guided to first look within Canada. So we already have that direction, and that is direction that we continue to follow. We do know that the tariffs, because some of the raw materials or the goods that we purchase do come from the United States and may have tariffs attached to them, and the vendor may choose to increase prices. And we've seen that in a couple of instances already where prices have started to increase. We do not have very many vendors that we purchase goods from, mostly, I would say software related, directly from the United States, and we are still awaiting the impact on those as we have existing contracts for those material or those products. But I hope that answers your question. And again, we already are following the directions under the broader public sector procurement guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you. And through the Chair.
Okay, we'll go that. We'll do that with Trustee.
Oh, wait.
Okay. Yeah, I think we'll let him present, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Okay.
And you can.
No problem.
Okay.
So just to follow up on Associate Director Zucker's comments, we have 4 US vendors and they are primary technology, with the largest one being Power Schools. We are also looking and contacting our vendors to understand the source of their goods, whether it's Canadian or US, so we can make adjustments where possible as the tariff situation unfolds. I'll stop there if there's any questions before contract awards.
Trustee Alaskan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. You may rule this out of order. It may or may not be related in your mind, but have there been instructions to the vendors or the agents that we use that facilitate school trips for kids in terms of travel to the United States?
Thank you. And through you, Chair, to Trustee Laskin, there has been no direction in that regard at this time.
Sorry, through the chair, I'm just gonna add that we do have our policy already says that we need to review every out of province conference or when
correct
that we're doing already. So as we do that, we do take into consideration things like the climate, but there isn't a blanket no. It's based on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, back in the first Trump era, where there was a concern, we did move a motion about no school trips to the US. We then changed that in terms of allowing for things like there was a cheerleader competition and a DECA competition, or things that were scholarly academic opportunities, but it didn't include like grade 8 grad trips to New York City, for example. I'm wondering if staff can check if we ever removed that. I would appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And through you, Chair, that's a request that we can take back, Trustee Laskin.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Anybody else?
Comment from Trustee Earhart.
Yeah, Trustee Earhart, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, and thanks to you, Chair, for bringing up the question. I just wanted to flag for trustees that in the blue folder tonight, there's a notice of motion. So not for discussion tonight. It will be considered at a future meeting, entitled Understanding the Impacts of U.S. Policies and Responses on the Toronto District School Board and TDSB's Contribution to these responses. So an elbows up motion, essentially, seeking to get a report on the impacts of U.S. policies and responses on the TDSB. This is just an emerging context. And so grateful for a verbal update tonight. This motion is being tabled to proposing for a broader update at a future time. And we will discuss this motion at a future meeting. I hope that's helpful, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Trustee Earhart. Any further? Okay, so please, Executive Officer Schneider, if you'll
Sure.
with the contracts.
Thank you. In tonight's contract awards, there's one for information Appendix A, and there are 2 contracts for award in Appendix C. There are no awards for Appendix B. Happy to take any questions from the committee.
I don't see any, so we will need a mover and a seconder. We're cognizant that A is for receipt and C is for approval. Can I get a mover and a seconder, please? Trustee Hassan will move.
Trustee Rajwani.
Trustee Rajwani will second. Thank you both. Can we please open the vote? I'm in favor.
Sean in favor.
Trustee Rajwani in favor.
Trustee Lee, are you with us? Is Trustee Lee? Please mark Trustee Lee absent and close the vote. Yeah. And that passes. Thank you. We will next move. The next item is 5.2, which are contract awards facilities, which is on page 9 of the agenda. Executive Officer Schneider.
Thank you, Chair. Tonight on the contract awards, there's 15 in Appendix A for information. There are 3 in Appendix B for committee approval, and there are 9 in Appendix C for board approval. And as always, we have our colleagues from facilities here to help answer any questions.
Trustees, do we have any questions? Hearing and seeing none. I want to acknowledge that Section A is for receipt and Section B and C are for approval. I'll need a mover and a seconder, please. Trustee Hassan will move. Trustee Hassan will move. I think Trustee Earhart indicated she would second. And with that, can we please open the vote?
Sean in favor.
Rajwani in favor.
And that passes. Thank you. And now, as previously discussed, we will move on to item 6.1, which is the advocacy and support of newcomer language programs, which is in page 39 of the agenda, brought by Trustees Earhart and Trustee DeVitis. Trustee Earhart, do you wish to speak to this?
Thanks very much. I'll just say quickly that this is something that I know trustees have expressed their dismay by. I am hoping that pending the outcomes of a federal election and a newer returning federal government, that we can engage in advocacy around this item in the hopes that we can reinstate some of the funding for our very important newcomer language programs that were cut, discontinued as a result of cuts and discontinuation of federal funding. Thanks very much to Trustee DeVitis for seconding this very important motion for our city and our broad communities. I'm happy to take any questions from any trustees. Thank you.
Trustee DeVitis, did you wish to?
No, that's fine, Chair. We can go ahead.
Thank you. Trustee Laskin.
Thank you very much. If you, Mr. Chair, to the mover. Trustee DeVitis, is this part of the NDP federal government program?
I'm not sure that you mean that in jest. Is that a serious question?
Yes, it was a serious question.
I don't know. To be honest, I'm not here in that role. I wouldn't be able to answer in that capacity.
No, and I can also offer a response here that this is a nonpartisan motion, but that reinstatement of funding losses is very important to all of us, and so I'm hopeful that it's something that will have broad-based support here in a nonpartisan manner, as this was something that was also put forward prior to the federal election. I will note that we gave notice of motion to this prior to federal election being called. I hope that's helpful context. Thank you.
Do you want? Yeah. Trustee Hassan?
Yeah, seeing how Trustee DeVitis is running with the NDP federally, how would that play into this motion? Could we get some clarification from staff?
So it's my understanding that, well, I mean, is legal here? Is Ms. Seville here?
Through you, Chair, legal is not in the room at this time. That is a question that we would need to take back at this time to fully consider, and may require some additional information to be able to do so.
Through the chair, I might also...
Trustee Earhart, thanks.
Sorry, just to...
At the beginning, we do the conflict of interest. It's for trustees to determine whether they have a conflict. None was declared. So we're going to operate under the premise that the trustee is operating and carrying out his duties.
Sorry, Chair. Right now we're in the middle of a federal election, and I believe Davides is a candidate. So I think this is definitely a conflict of interest.
It doesn't, okay. Yeah.
Personal privilege. I'm unclear what the
Trustee
conflict.
Trustee Earhart, thank you. Again, this is, if legal were here, I would ask for a recess and we would declare with legal. But my understanding is that this is a matter for trustees to declare whether they have a conflict or not. These programs existed before the call. It is for the trustee in question to determine whether he's in conflict. He declared no conflict. And as such, we're going to allow this to proceed. We can, if there are options for trustees on the committee, what we do with this, whether we refer it back to staff, whether we put it on, like, there are a number of options for trustees to consider if they're concerned about the timing. But as it pertains to conflict, the member, Trustee Davides, has declared no conflict, and we believe him to be a man of his word, and we believe that, and we're going to proceed under that premise. Anybody else?
I have my hand up if it's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, listen, for the sake of clarity, I didn't write this motion. I'm just supporting the motion that someone else wrote before the timeline for the election was clear. It didn't even occur to me that this would be seen potentially as a conflict, but I don't want that to stain the letter because we're writing advocacy on behalf of the board. If someone else would like to move the motion, it doesn't have to have my name on it. I can also refrain from voting on it if that would be a sort of good. So if Trustee Laskin or Trustee Hassan would like to second the motion instead, if they're in support of the motion, I think it would be better for the board to have that. That's not an issue for me. To be honest, I didn't even understand the reason for the question until I thought about it. I don't want to get into a longer conversation. I don't want to sort of delay it. I think it comes from a good place. Trustee Earhart did all the labor on it. I was supporting her motion by seconding it. I'm not sure that there is a conflict, but the appearance of conflict, it can be important as well. And so I'm happy to allow somebody else to second the motion that sits in the committee if they wish to.
Okay, thank you, Trustee. Thank you, Trustee Davides. It's worth noting that Trustee Laskin isn't a member of the committee and as such isn't free to. Trustee Shen? Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, initially, I need a seconder for the motion before we re-put it on the floor. Is there
the motion, Mr. Chair?
Trustee Shen, you'll second the motion?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so it's back on the floor, and I understand Trustee Rajwani, you wish to speak to this.
That's okay. I was gonna second it, but I think we're moving along in the right direction. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further questions? Okay, we'll open the vote, please.
Trustee Lee is in favor.
Thank you, Trustee Lee, and welcome to the meeting.
Thank you.
Trustee Rajwani in favor.
None in favor.
Trustee Earhart in favor.
And that passes. Thank you. Now we'll go to item 6.2, which is the potential hazards related to airport activity from the Toronto Pearson Airport on surrounding schools. And that's being offered by Trustee Davides and myself. And with that, I will pass the chair to Vice Chair Hassan.
Yep, go ahead.
Chair, can I go ahead? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, Davides, go ahead.
Thank you. So this motion came about because of communications from neighbors over the last few years around the increased level of noise. And I think to some degree what happened is we had a bit of a quieter period around COVID, and when the noise came back, it became much more noticeable. I think that's one of the elements on it, but I've come to the realization over the last a few years that my level of understanding about the impact of noise on human health is something that I had very little knowledge about. Going back in time, the Romans had aqueducts, they had lead in the aqueducts, and eventually that led to all kinds of health issues there. Same thing can be said for things like cholera in the 19th century and so on. So there are many things that, it takes society longer to catch up to the realization in terms of the effect of human activity on human health than what we know. So this is a motion to try and deal with the potential health risks. The actual impacts are something that I'm agnostic on at this point, and I would like to give our staff the opportunity to go out and have a conversation with folks that are better versed on it to understand the type of best practices that we should be following on a move forward basis, as well as understanding what we should be doing with those schools that are impacted by airplane noise as sort of identify the danger areas by Transport Canada. So with that, I'll pass it along. I'm hoping we can get approval on this at the committee at board. And then when we get a report back, we can have a fulsome conversation about what this all may mean for some of our schools on the west end of the city.
Yep, go ahead, Trustee McLean.
Thank you, and through the chair. Just a question to staff around when staff reports back, if this in the event that this is successful, will there be an opportunity for staff to report back on the specific buildings identified in the area to see if there are anything we do from a system point of view structurally to account for the challenges relating to the noise pollution? Is there an opportunity to maybe reach out to the Greater Toronto Transit or Airport Authority around any, potential grants or any expertise that they might need to see whether, we could prove the concept that there are challenges. Our students are facing some risks associated with this and might potentially help us if we were to seek structural things that we would do from a facilities point of view to upgrade these buildings to help mitigate the potential challenges.
Through you, Chair, I'll ask Executive Officer Maya Pachetti to respond.
Thank you. And through the chair, yes, to Trustee McLean, I think that is exactly what we would need to do. We have identified that there are 41 schools that are within the area that is noted in this motion, the noise exposure forecast areas. And we can look at this problem at several fronts at the same time. So identify the age of those buildings, the construction of those buildings, because the year in which those buildings were built or subsequent additions tells us a lot about what the building envelope is going to be like and what the types of windows are going to be like, which are features that often can be enhanced to address sound isolation or sound improvements. But at the same time that we're doing that, I think it is very important to have that conversation with the Airport Transportation Authority to see how perhaps they have dealt with this issue in other urban areas, not just the City of Toronto, but other urban areas where there are airports within proximity of residences and schools. So yes, we can. That's the way we would intend to look at this. And we will need to seek some expertise from consultants who have, looked at this, who have studied this, because we don't really have that kind of expertise in-house, but there are people out there who we can contact and have them study this.
Thank you. And then through you, Mr. Chair, would the report be able to indicate the costs associated with that work so that the committee would be in a position to? That's great. Thank you. I'll note for those online that the executive officer is nodding her head and that would work. And I just, before I pass the close, I will note that given the age of those buildings, when those schools were built, we had, there was an east-west runway and a north-south run. There are now 5 runways. So even if some mitigating things were put in initially, there's some challenges that weren't anticipating the reality of 2025. So I thank staff, and I look forward, in the event that this is successful, I look forward to the report. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I'll now pass it over to Trustee Erhart.
Thanks very much. I wanted to, first of all, thanks very much to mover and seconder of this motion. I think I'm in the ward I represent, I've taken a great interest in noise mitigations around Metrolinx Ontario line construction. I can really well understand the need for unique targeted approaches and also the need for some thinking on this. So thank you so much for taking the initiative with this. I did want to ask just if there are any other schools around other airports that staff could or would consider with this. I just don't know if around Billy Bishop there would be, and this is my lack of knowledge, if there's anything for similar considerations there. And thanks so much.
Through the chair, we can certainly include that in our study. I think Billy Bishop is smaller, and I'm not positive. I don't have that expertise, but it tends to have smaller planes. And I don't know whether that makes an impact or not, but that is certainly something that we can look at as well.
Thanks so much. I wouldn't introduce any amendments on that, just based on that response, but that would be helpful just to give that context, just if there's anything else more broadly that we want to consider. And as well, for report on best practices for health risks. This is around airplane noise specifically. That sounds great. And just thanks to facility staff for all of your continued work in this area for noise mitigations citywide. Thanks again.
I'll now pass it over to Trustee Lee.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I just want to thank Trustee Davides for moving this motion. I think it's very important, especially during this period. I know you're fairly busy. I love the motion. I have a question on how far the definition of pollution we can or should expand towards more than just airport, and possibly thinking about air pollution, because I think the TDSB has a good number of schools built adjacent to major highways, controlled access 400 series highways. Off top, I can think of Avondale Elementary School, which is built right adjacent to Highway 401. George Henry Secondary School is right at the intersection of Highway 401 and Highway 404, along with a number of other schools. So their noise will always be an issue. Plus, the government of Ontario has produced official documents saying residing within 500 meters of a major highway creates tremendous health risks to anyone, especially children. So, through you, Mr. Chair, to staff, what is the likelihood for us to expand this study to include air pollution for the schools that are adjacent to major controlled access highways as well?
Thank you. And through the chair, it is certainly something we can comment on in the report, perhaps at a higher, more general level than focusing in on the noise concerns in this report. and I'm happy to take that away and look into it and include something in the report. Perhaps not as detailed, but bringing something back to trustees as per your comment.
Thank you, through Mr. Chair. I appreciate that to the executive officer. I think that'll be great if you can look into it and let us know if it's something that we should be concerned about, because that'll guide next steps. I don't want to make work if there shouldn't be any, but any commentary, any thoughts that you could take on either the noise or the air pollution for our schools next to the highways, and even letting us know how many there are will really help, I think, settle a lot of minds on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Lee. Is there anyone else on the list?
Arts. Trustee Arts,
floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the movers to bringing this up. I, like Trustee Lee, I don't want to ask for an amendment to expand it, but I've also had concerns locally about rail lines because we've heard, I think, quite a bit recently from the Metrolinx expansions of railways run past a number of our schools in East Toronto. And so noise concerns have come up there. But I just wanted to give a plug for Toronto Public Health that a colleague of mine working there a couple of years ago was actually working on a study, exactly this study. So I'm not sure exactly where that landed, but we might not have to reinvent the wheel. I think Toronto Public Health may have already done this work specifically on noise pollution and next to large projects like transit lines, rail lines, airports, and things like that. So I do know that they engaged in this study a couple of years ago, and we're making health recommendations. We're looking to make health and policy recommendations on noise pollution specifically. So that might be a source to start with. And might be a lot of the background work that we need. So thank you, that's all.
No, you open the vote. Well, we have a mover in a second, right? So you just open the vote.
Okay, we'll now be opening up the vote.
Trustee Lee's in favor.
Trustee Rajwani in favor.
Trustee Earhart in favor.
Shan in favor.
And that passes. And with that, I'll take the chair back. Thank you, sir. And before we continue on to 5.3, can I ask that the trustees that have joined recently online can identify themselves so that the record could reflect accordingly?
Trustee Pay present, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Trustee Pay.
Yeah.
Trustee Hastings, thank you, Trustee Hastings. Okay, thank you very much. And with that, we will, the next item is 5.3, which is the update to the budget consultation, which is on page 23 of the agenda. And this is for receipt. Director Latouche.
Thank you. And through you, Chair, Executive Officer Craig Snyder will speak to it.
Thank you. And through the chair, and on page 24, I'll direct your attention. We have updated the consultations for the public, and we are looking at in Central doing it at 50-50 on April 10th. It'll be both virtual and in person. Downtown, we're still determining that final location. For East, it will be Woolburn on April 17th in person, and in West, it would be Burnham Thorpe, again in person. The question we would like some feedback from the trustees tonight is around student consultation. There are two options here. The first option would look to do a session on April 24th This is the meeting of the Student Senate that afternoon, and we would just ask for the start the session with doing our consultation from 6:30 to 8:30, and then the Student Senate meeting could continue after, or just having the Student Senate meeting on the 24th, and we would present to them, and then having a Saturday session on April 26th for all other students that aren't part of the Student Senate. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you, Executive Officer. Trustee Laskin.
I'm wondering, and I know the student trustees aren't here, but I'm wondering, have you reached out directly to the student trustees about the student consultation? Through you, Mr. Chair, to staff?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't believe we have, but I'd be sure because it could have been somebody else that contacted, but I will make a reach out.
I'm wondering through you, Mr. Chair, if maybe that might be a good step. My other question is, in the past, we have actually met with the unions on the budget and staff so that staff didn't feel they had to come to the public consultation, but we heard their input. Is there any thought about getting input from staff in advance of the public consultations, or staff would come as well to the public consultations? Through you, Mr. Chair, to staff? Thank you.
Through you, Chair. Thank you for that question, Trustee Laskin. That's something that we'll need to take back and confirm whether that has been planned or can be planned. However, I do appreciate you surfacing that as a recommendation for us to consider, as I do believe that that will support the budget consultation process and how the appropriate ways for staff voice to be heard, other than necessarily at the board, in the boardroom.
Thank you very much. Through you, Mr. Chair, to the director. During the process a number of years ago, we did reach out to the union and federation leads, and we gave them some time to, through them, get their members' input so people didn't feel they had to come and identify themselves in a public way. So it's just a thought. Obviously, it's up to staff. My other question is, if you're having difficulty from a downtown perspective, I can offer a midtown school on the subway. I'm thinking of Davisville or North Toronto, for example. So I just throw that out there as another option. Midtown folks, it's easy for them to go downtown, or on the subway line, it's also easy for them to come up to 50/50. Yeah. So I have no issue. You don't need a separate kind of midtown consultation, but just if you were having difficulty with a downtown one, I'm sure we can expand that if you needed a different venue. Just wanted to make that offer through you, Mr. Chair, to staff.
Thank you, Trust. Sorry.
Oh, I apologize.
No, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, thanks for that that offer. Through you, Chair, to Trustee Laskin. We do have a location in mind for the downtown school, but we'll consider that should there be a need. And the location will be publicized in time for folks to be able to plan and respond accordingly.
Thank you. That conclude, Trustee Laskin?
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Williams.
Thank you, and through the chair. So with regard to the downtown budget town hall, I've actually secured the permit at Harvard Collegiate for that purpose, 6:30 to 8:30. So just sharing that here. And just a comment, last year when we did the budget town hall, it was, I think, very well attended and very engaging, and happy to see that we're including the downtown budget town hall again in this consultation, this round of consultation, public consultations. So permit secure. So Harvard Collegiate Institute, downtown budget town hall, Tuesday, February 15th, 6:30 to 8:30. With regard to the the question before us about the student budget town hall and the two options. I agree that it would be very appropriate to reach out to our student trustees to gain input on that. And in fact, I did reach out to our student trustees and they seem to be very supportive of option one. So just adding that to the consideration of the members of FBEC here in the discussion. And I think those are my comments and questions for now. Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, Harvard was just, I listened to my emails, I apologize, I didn't have it out in time for the report to be public, but we do agree that Harvard is where we will be doing the downtown session, and we appreciate the feedback that option one, but we will check with Student Senate, and I'll check with Executive Superintendent, I forgot his name.
Jack
Nigro, yes. That he's, believe he's contacted Student Senate, but I will confirm one way or the other if he's contacted Student Senate to get their advice.
And through the chair, thank you for that response. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Williams. Trustee Earhart?
Thank you. I just reiterate that I defer to students for the student engagement. And so if we want to refer that to student trustees, I don't know if formally within our bylaws we can do that for student trustees, but I'd be happy to. I just, while we're here through the chair, I did want to seek clarification. I had thought that there was going to be a standalone virtual option for all school communities, not exclusively the student community. Am I to understand that that's going to be the central on Thursday, April 10th as a hybrid meeting? Is that the only virtual option for attendance? Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct.
Okay, thanks. And through the chair, by way of feedback, if it can be accommodated in the schedule, I would still like a broader virtual option just because of the challenge in conducting hybrid meetings versus a targeted virtual meeting. And I think it would be helpful for parents who also have childcare obligations. And due to the distance, I can say from the ward I represent, each of these represents at least 1 hour on public transit to access. So having a standalone virtual would still be a way to improve access if it can be accommodated within the timelines. And thanks very much.
Through you, Mr. Chair, with that comment from the trustee, I would just ask the committee, one of the challenges we found was trying to find the schedule of times because we were respectful of committee meetings where trustees would have to be at a committee meeting versus wanting to attend to hear the feedback in person. So these dates have been picked to try to do that. We can try to find additional dates, but it was very difficult within the time frame of the budget process to fit these dates in with all the Easter long weekend, for example, as well as committee meetings and advisory committee meetings that we know trustees feel important to attend those as well.
Trustee Earhart, could you clarify the difference between, or what you perceive to be the difference between the online capability or the virtual component to the meeting on the 10th and the virtual meeting that you're suggesting?
Thanks very much. Through the chair, my experience, although perhaps there can be ways to modify this, is that when hybrid meetings are conducted, often an emphasis is placed more on one versus the other because we're trying to accommodate two methods of conveying information at the same time, one being those in person and one being those online. And I know we do attempt to do that through our meetings here, but when dealing with a broader public audience, it can be challenging. And so wanting to make sure that there is at least one option with a focus. I would like to make sure that those who can't physically attend the locations across the city have an option where there's some focus on the conveying of information to them and also hearing their inputs. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And with that, is it is it conceivable, given that we have 3 other in-person, that the meeting of the 10th be virtual only? Is that something that staff thinks would meet the intent of what we're trying to accomplish? And if
through you, Mr. Chair, the challenge with the other sites will be to do a multimedia. TDSB, this room is set up very well to have a virtual as well as in person. But to Trustee Earhart's concerns, I will work with the comms department, and as we've done other webinars for staff or other organizations, we can ask Mr. Bird or someone from communications part to moderate, and they can watch the questions for us so that we get an equal number of questions from both the in-person as well as the online. So I think we could accommodate the virtual meeting to ensure that participation is not limited to online or in-person participants.
Okay, great. And with that, and there's no one further on the list. So I need this is for receipt. I need a mover and a seconder, please. I'll move it. Trustee Hassan will move. I need a seconder.
Oh, I'm happy to second.
Trustee Earhart will second. Can we open the vote, please? McLean in favor.
Shan in favor.
Trustee Rajwani in favor.
Lee in favor.
Yeah, please mark him absent. And that passes. Thank you. And we will now move on to item 5.4, which is the last staff report for tonight, which is the structural deficit update, which is on page 27 of the agenda. And this will be for receipt. Director Latouche.
Thank you. And through you, Chair, pleased to move to Associate Director Zucker to present the report.
Thank you. And through the chair, trustees will have received the PowerPoint presentation. I would suggest that either you can follow along on the presentation as you've received it, or if you use Appendix A, which is on page 37 and 38 of the report, to follow along, that may also help when we're looking at the different areas. So completely up to trustees, but you do have access to the presentation as well. So first, just looking at our timeline, we are on March 26th at FBEC, and we are listening to the structural deficit update. We did get our projected financial position in February. As you just heard, we will be looking, the month of April will be dedicated to public consultation, receiving feedback, and also staff doing their analysis of all the areas that are overfunded to determine what will come forward to be presented to trustees as options to balance. Those options will be presented in April 30th FBEC. There will be a draft of the budget based on those options in May, and then the final budget in June. Obviously, the timelines of those in particular can change depending on the information or the direction from trustees, but that is the projected timeline right now, and what was projected in the budget schedule at the beginning of the school year. So just as a reminder, again, TDSB is operating a structural deficit, meaning that our planned spending each year is it greater than our expected revenues. And in some cases, we are choosing to spend more in certain areas than we're funded based on our priorities and based on our multi-year strategic plan. And in some cases, it's because we're not fully funded in areas, whether it's funding that hasn't continued to increase with the cost of all of the supplies and the salaries and benefits that we have, or whether it is that we have never been funded in a certain area and we continue not to be. So as we look at our projected deficit, on February 28th, we did present a report that showed a projected deficit for 25-26 of $65.9 million. As a result of the motion that was passed to add back the unfunded vice principals at about 4.4 million, the updated projected financial position for next year is expected to be a deficit of 70.3 million. So as a result of previous structural deficits and also as a result of using the reserves during COVID, the board hasn't had a working fund reserve or a reserve without a specific purpose attached to it since 2021. So since then, any operating deficits that the board has been using our internally restricted reserves. And that means that those internally restricted reserves are not available for the purposes in which they were intended. So at the end of 2023, you'll notice that in the chart that is included in the report, that the board only has $26.7 million of internally restricted reserves at the end of 23-24. And we do have a projected deficit of 28 million during the current year, of which we are using proceeds of disposition. But as we know, proceeds of disposition are not unlimited, require ministry approval, and are not really a sustainable way of balancing our budget. So as a result of having a deficit and not having reserves in order to cover it, even though the ministry does allow a 1% deficit, there is a caveat that there must be reserves in order to cover it. So because we don't have that ability to have a 1% deficit. So we had to submit a deficit recovery plan. And in that deficit recovery plan, the ministry did require us to make some commitments. So there is a commitment as part of the recovery plan that we will have an $11 million deficit for 25-26, and then a balanced budget in 26-27. And as part of those commitments, there's also a commitment to reduce spending in areas outside of our core mandate, and they refer to our core mandate as K-12 education. And then there's also a commitment to reduce spending when one-time funding ends unless there is an offset to support the sustainable continuation of additional positions. So basically, if we receive one-time funding, we use that one-time funding for one-time costs. When the funding goes away, the expectation is that the costs, or if it's staffing, the positions go away unless we find savings in our budget. We know that the Auditor General, as part of their report, their performance report on TDSB that was released in December 2024, did have a section on financial management. And that's on page 31 of the Auditor General report. Section 4.2 speaks to financial management. And recommendation number 8 states that we recommend that TDSB and the ministry work together to understand whether the TDSB has a structural deficit. Well, we know we do, so that one's an easy one. And how the TDSB's unique circumstances play a role in its financial challenges. So that was the recommendation from the Auditor General. Both the TDSB and the ministry, as a result of it being a recommendation for both of us, were required to respond. We both outlined concerns. And so our concerns were all of those things that are unfunded, that don't have a funding source. And we gave some examples, which are included in Appendix A. And then the ministry's concerns were that TDSB is spending money that is outside of our core mandate on not a cost recovery basis. So again, both the ministry and TDSB outlined their concerns, but did agree to work together. And so that commitment is part of the Auditor General recommendation. We have reached out to ministry staff. They were waiting for the swearing in of cabinet. And once that has happened, we will continue to meet in order to adhere to that recommendation. But really, it is in the best interest of both TDSB and the ministry to really address those issues, which are especially the ones that are unique to TDSB. And so we will have started to have those conversations, and we will continue to have them as well. So we receive most of our funding from the Ministry of Education through the core education funding, or what we will refer to as core ed, and what we used to refer to as the GSN. And in the ministry guidelines, it does state that education funding is intended to mirror cost structures, but the board has flexibility in their actual expenditures. So school boards determine their budget based on the Education Act and based on relevant regulations and memoranda that are released by the ministry. The flexibility is intentional, and this is where boards have the opportunity to determine their budget based on their priorities and still maintain a balanced budget. So as a result of there being that flexibility, TDSB, like all school boards, we don't go through each of our expenditures on a dollar by dollar basis and identify a specific funding source for them. In some cases we have to, as there are limitations, but we don't do it for every single dollar that we spend, and it would be very challenging to do so. So it's not always easy to determine underfunding and overspending. And we just provided a couple of examples here. So we receive funding under an allocation that they would provide funding for professionals and paraprofessionals. And really that means staffing that support schools directly. And so it's all that funding comes together, but it's not allocated together. And the examples that the ministry provides are IT techs, lunchroom supervisors, our school-based safety monitors, mental health supports. So those are examples of positions that are funded from paraprofessionals and professionals. But again, the funding isn't allocated to them specifically. So it's up to the board to determine how this funding is spent. In addition, the differentiated support allocation, which used to be the LOG grant, is provided to boards to address learning and programs based on demographic, socioeconomic, and other indicators associated with barriers to success. So this is the grant that supports us adding, when we did it through school-based staffing, teachers that were supporting our LOI school, or high LOI schools. It's how we support the Center of Excellence for Black Student Achievement and many other areas of the board, some of which are included on this list. And so again, we don't go through that grant line by line and determine how it's allocated. If we did that, there wouldn't be enough grant, and therefore, again, staff would not be in the position to determine which dollars are funded and which ones are not, which of our expenses that would meet the definition of this grant are funded and which are not. So in the past, when we've provided information with regards to the LOG grant, and I know that we've made a commitment to provide that information moving forward, so we will, but we don't, again, allocate it dollar for dollar. We say, here's the grant, here are all the things that the board does that would fall under that definition, and that number in the past and will be moving forward is always more than the funding that we receive. And so, you know, staff is not going to go through and say, okay, of all of the things that are funded by that grant, this is what's truly what we're spending it on, and this is what we're not. So that's why this exercise is difficult, and I just wanted to say that up front because it's really important as you look through it and say, well, wait a second, we get more funding than what has been identified here. It's because we're only identifying the specific funding for these areas. And we'll get into that, and you'll see that more as we walk through the presentation. This is a quote from the Ministry of Education in the technical paper, which is a very detailed analysis of how we receive funding. It says that education funding recognizes that school boards need flexibility to decide how to best allocate resources within their budget. At the same time, there are restrictions on how school boards may use certain components of their allocation. So again, just showing that the ministry does expect flexibility in the use of the funding, and they provide funding in that way to allow boards to make decisions, again, based on their multi-year strategic plan, based on the needs of students within their boards. I wanted to quickly outline the limitations that, again, are in the technical paper, which comes directly from the ministry. And these are mostly either by regulation or by the memorandum or the Education Act as indicated in the previous slide. So budgets must be balanced. Class size regulations must be respected. NTIP must be spent on NTIP. That's new teacher funding for new teachers. Indigenous education must be spent on Indigenous education. Mental health and wellness allocation must be spent on mental health and wellness. Student safety must be spent on student safety. Program leadership must be spent on in that area as well. SHISM, SHSM must be spent on that area. Special education must be spent on special education. So in those instances, and you'll see many of those on the list today, we spend more than we have received. So we are meeting all of those requirements. In addition, this is new in the core education funding because the core education, again, is a new way of receiving funding from the ministry beginning in the year that we're currently in. And it talks about the student transportation fund and the school facilities fund. And so there are maximums placed on those. So again, it's intended, as TDSB does, to spend funding as best we can on students in the classroom, right? So anything that is outside of the classroom, which would be transportation, school facilities, as we indicate here, and then also school board administration, as is indicated in the last bullet, those are maximums that are placed on school boards by the ministry. So the school board administration expense shall not exceed the expense limit equal to 2.1 million plus 3.5% of the school board's total expenses. And I want to assure trustees that we are within that funding envelope. And we are within the transportation of school facilities as well. So we are meeting all of these limitations that are required by the ministry. And we do use funds flexibly when there are no specific funding sources for areas of priority within the board. So Appendix A, as I indicated, it's on page 37 and 38 of your agenda package. And you will see that the appendix is divided into 3 sections. Areas not within control of TDSB, partially within control, and within control of TDSB. And so I just want to be really clear on what today is about and what's being presented today and what it's not. This is a list that shows you the unfunded, underspent, and overspent areas of the budget. Sorry, unfunded, underfunded, and overspent areas of the budget. We have provided this list in previous years. However, we haven't gone into a lot of detail on this list, and we thought it was really important to bring it forward for trustees to have this data and allow trustees to be able to make informed decisions and to assist in the budget process. This list is not a judgment on the value of certain budget areas. And this is not a list of suggested reductions. This is a list of where we're overspending, underfunding, and or unfunded. It will allow staff to do further analysis where we can propose operational efficiencies that will assist in balancing the budget, where we will be able to propose other options to balance the budget. And again, it'll help us, this analysis will significantly help us in working with the ministry to identify funding challenges that impact TDSB. And so because of what this is, and it's on, and again, this is for receipt today, we're not making decisions today, this is purely information. There may be questions that trustees have today that staff will defer to when the analysis is complete and when recommendations are being made to the board. So again, if you do have a question and we say, can you just please hold on that? It's not that we don't have the information, it's that we want to make sure that today is about providing this information and that the next time we talk about it, it's about making decisions about the information. And I think those are 2 really important things that as we go through this information, we have an understanding. So please, if we do say, thank you for the question, we're gonna bring back more information. It's because we are using that information in order for us to do the analysis that is described on the slide. So I'm going to go through each one of the areas that are on the appendix. And again, this is where you may want to follow along either with the presentation or have that appendix in front of you. It may help. And the first area is things that are not within control of TDSB. And as trustees will recognize, this is not new, right? Some of these slides we were able to basically use last year's because we're having the same challenges. So the first one is our unfunded increase in statutory benefits. So we know that CBP has been increasing since 2019. And we know that employment insurance has also been increasing over the same time period. And yet there has not been a corresponding increase in funding. So each year as that increase happens, there's an unfunded portion. And so in 2020, there would have been an unfunded portion. And the next year and continuing on, and that number continued to increase to 2024, 25, where that unfunded amount is $43.7 million. And I didn't add this before, and I had it in my notes, but I just want to make sure the numbers that we're looking at in this appendix are 24, 25 revised budget numbers. So any changes that will happen in 25, 26 have not been included in this analysis. Unfunded teacher salaries. So again, this isn't new. We know that in 2014, the province began central bargaining and developed a central teacher grid. Funding for teachers is based on that central grid. So if you are a board that has the central grid as your grid, then you are funded basically dollar for dollar for teacher salaries. So that I think is most of the, I believe it is most of the province. At that time, when the central grid was developed, the TDSB grid was higher than the central grid. So that led to an unfunded amount per teacher because we're still funded at the central grid level. And so again, it's not a significant amount when you look at it on an individual basis, but in a cumulative basis, so because we have 10,000 teachers, we're looking at $26.1 million that we have that many, if not, well, I'm going to say most boards across the province who are on the central grid do not have this same challenge. In the same way, DECE salaries, we had DECEs at TDSB before full day kindergarten started. And that's when most of the province started adding DECEs to their employees. So because we had them before the central or before full day kindergarten, we obviously had a salary attached to those individuals. When the DECEs were added to the funding, a benchmark was created for DECEs, and most boards would have said, okay, well, if this is how much we're getting funded for them, this is how much we're going to pay them. But our grid was already higher than that amount. So again, we have a shortfall here of about $1.5 million for our DECE salaries that most boards will not have. The last one, and again, not new, but maybe the numbers will be new to you and maybe a little staggering. We have more capacity than we have students. We have 63,000 more spaces in schools than there are students. And so that results in underutilized schools, and we say here the potential to close schools to reduce operating costs, but really the necessity to close schools, not only to reduce operating costs, but to improve program delivery. So our challenge in that, obviously, is that the provincial moratorium on school closures prevents us from going through the pupil accommodation review, right-sizing our schools so that our operating costs are in line with our funding. Because our funding is mostly based on enrollment, our funding is not based on square footage. So if we have less students, we get less funding, but it costs us the same to maintain those buildings. And so at one point, the ministry recognized this, and they called it, they gave us a grant, which was called a top-up grant. So what they said was, we recognize that if you have 700 students in a school, or if you have 1,000 students in a school that is meant for 1,000 students, most of the costs are going to be the same to operate that school. So the ministry would provide a grant to say, okay, you're only getting funding for 700 students, but we're going to top you up in recognition of costs being higher. So at the same time, or in 2014, the ministry recognized that providing this grant may have been a deterrent to doing the hard work of closing schools, which would result in permanent savings. And so they indicated that they were going to get rid of this top-up grant in order to encourage boards to close schools. But then the moratorium came in place, and so therefore the grant was gone to help us with the funding of those extra spaces, but we have no ability to deal with it. So we have done a calculation to say, using our utilization today, if the top-up grant were still in place, and again, there have been no changes that have happened that allow us to deal with the excess capacity, we would receive $41.3 million in top-up funding. So we are counting that as a loss in funding that is outside of our control, and there's nothing that we can do in order to create certainly $41 million in operating savings, but anywhere close to $41 million in savings. So I'm going to move on to the next section, or the yellow section that you see, which is things that are partially within our control. So the first is unfunded increases in LTD and WSIB. And I would say that most of this is outside of our control, but we have certain obligations to make sure that we're creating a safe environment for staff. And so that part, I would say, is within our control. But examples of things that are outside of our control and that impact all employers across Canada include the interest rates as they increase or decrease as they fluctuate. It changes the calculations. Inflation, an aging workforce, rising mental health concerns, and the increased prevalence of chronic illnesses all have an impact on LTD and WSIB. And the increase since 2018 is approximately 18 million annually, and there has not been a corresponding increase in funding. So again, it's partially within our control, and we are making strides at making sure that we are doing what we can to help to keep this cost as low as possible. But there certainly are things that are outside of our control, but it does create a shortfall of $18 million. The next area, and we talk about this a lot, is funding for special education. And this is, again, just the costs that are being incurred for special education. This isn't necessarily, and I'm sure that if you talk to SEAC or parents of students that have special education needs, or parents of students that don't have special education needs, they would say that there's always more spending that the board can do in this area. But when we compare the special education fund specifically to the costs that are allocated to special education, there's a shortfall in funding of $38.5 million. You will hear from the ministry, and this is accurate, that we do receive funding for students that have special education needs through the Classroom Staffing Fund and the Learning Resource Fund, in that every student in the board generates funding for classroom teachers. And so that funding will help to support students and their classroom teachers with students with special education needs. It is challenging to be able to, again, go through dollar by dollar and to say that each of these areas is funding this specific thing. So this is a common practice for school boards to look at the special education fund specifically and compare it to special education expenditures. What I'll also say on the other side is there are some expenditures that are fairly significant, like transportation, that are not included in the special education expenditures. So when we're looking at a true comparison of all of the costs related to special education versus all of the funding related to special education, it is a challenging calculation. So we do what most boards do, which is look at the funding that comes in specifically under that special education grant and compare it to the expenditures which are allocated to special education by the ministry's code of accounts. The next area that is partially within our control is the replacement costs for sick leave for teachers and ECEs. We have separated teachers and ECEs out specifically because it is those are the only positions through the core education funding that we can see specific funding allocations for supply costs. So the funding that we receive through the classroom staffing fund for supply teachers and DCEs is $44.5 million. Our total cost for supply teachers and supply ECEs is $110.5 million, leading to a shortfall of $66 million. So again, there may be other grants like ESL grant that has grants for teachers, for example, that include a component related to replacement costs, but it's not specifically allocated so staff don't have that ability to actually break it down in that detail. So with the information that we have, the shortfall is $66 million. And again, I wouldn't say that this is the place where we will get into the why and what we're doing about it. But it is something that staff is working on reducing. The next area that we were talking about is school administration. So school administration is the funding that funds principals, vice principals, and our school office administration or our clerical staff that are in schools. School office administration is funding through the Learning Resource Fund, and it is based on school-by-school enrollment. And our underfunding in this area is really as a result of three main reasons. One is that our salaries and benefits for our clerical staff is about $18,000 per FTE more than our benchmarks. So our costs are $18,000 more than our benchmarks. We do have more principals and vice principals than calculated by the ministry funding formula. And the ministry does not provide funding for sick or paid leave for these employees. So when we look at the allocation of the $35.4 million of overspending on this allocation, about 14.8 of it is related to the salary and benefit differential. About 6.8 of it is related to the fact that we have more than we're funded for. And about 13.8 is related to our budget for replacement costs for sick leave and paid leave for these positions specifically. Continuing education, we do list what's included in continuing education. And again, trustees will recall that we did bring a report related to continuing education last year through the budget process and identified certain areas where we would achieve or could achieve efficiencies, but it does include international languages, community programs, secondary credit courses, summer programs, adult education, and general interest courses. In most school boards across Ontario, continuing education is run either at cost recovery or at a surplus. We do receive funding in these areas based on enrollment and in some cases fees collected. We are overspending or unfunded in a number of areas, and two of them include funding benchmarks for our instructors are lower than our actual cost. So that's something that's out of our control. We can't control the funding, and our instructors are unionized, so the costs are also out of our control, and the two don't match. We can, though, look at optimization of resources through program delivery. And those are some of the things that we have talked about before. And again, through the budget process, we'll bring more information related to continuing education to a future meeting. So today we are outlining that we spend more than we are funded for by 4.7 million. And what I will say is, this is for this current year's budget. This is almost $2 million better than it was last year. Last year, I think it was 6.6 million that we were overspending. So we have recognized some efficiencies in continuing education. So this is an improvement, and there is more work that we can do. For school safety, the board receives $5.1 million in funding for safe and accepting schools. And if you recall, under the limitations, it said that we had to spend this funding on safety. So we do, and then some. Schools may use the board's professional and paraprofessional support component to support student safety. But again, we don't allocate that grant specifically to expenditures. Therefore, it's not included in the appendix as a revenue source. But through school safety, when we're talking about school safety, we're talking about our school-based safety monitors. We're talking about our safe and caring schools department. And we are talking about the additional safety positions that were previously funded with COVID, that the continuation of those positions was approved on March 5th. So our school-based safety monitor expense is about 16.9 million. Our safe and caring department and the staff and the expenses that supported is about 14.7 million. Our additional safety positions funded with COVID that are continuing are about 4 million. And we have funding of 5.1 million. So we do have a shortfall of 30.5 million. But again, some of that shortfall could be funded through paraprofessional and professional funding. Mental health supports is similar in that we receive funding of 5.3 million specific to mental health supports. And there is a requirement from the ministry that we spend it in that area. We spend significantly more, and we could use the professional and paraprofessional support component to address them. But again, this funding has not been allocated in this analysis. So the costs associated with mental health supports total 19.2 million, creating a shortfall of 13.9 million. And again, I will direct trustees back to the Auditor General report. When they talked about, say, under one of the safety provisions, it talked about mental health supports and how the supports that TDSB provides have not been increasing at the same rate that the need for our students has been increasing, and suggested that we would need, I think the number was 3 times the amount of support. And obviously our recommendation basically said happy to add if we had additional funding. The shortfall of 13.9 million is certainly an area that is a concern for the board, and is hopeful that additional funding could be provided. Elementary supervision or lunchroom supervisors, again, somewhat similar in that we receive funding through the classroom support or classroom staffing fund for elementary supervision. It totals 5.8 million. We do use lunchroom supervisors at elementary schools to supervise students as they eat lunch. We use our enrollment and number of classes to allocate those lunchroom supervisors. And the cost to the board is 19.2 million, creating a shortfall of $14 million. Transportation is administered through the Toronto Student Transportation Group, which is a consortium with the Catholic Board. The funding formula was updated 2 years ago, and TDSB did receive additional funding as a result. So that was an important funding, a relook at funding by the ministry that had a positive impact on TDSB. Our transportation costs are determined by our transportation policy, which talks about who's eligible for transportation. The walk distances are two of the main factors that determine our costs. We did have a new transportation contract that started this year, which did result in increased costs. It was an increase of about, I think it was 16% over previous contracts. So we do know that our costs will continue to increase in this area, and that was indicated through our financial position that was presented in February. And we just made a note here because this has been something that's been reviewed in the past and has been asked for in the past, and that is that the cost of transportation for French immersion represents $6.3 million of our transportation costs. So because of the increased funding 2 years ago, our transportation right now is underfunded by $1.2 million. But again, as indicated in the financial position report that came forward in February, this will increase to $7.9 million in 25-26 unless additional funding is provided through the core education funding. School operations and facilities, we talked about this as one of our challenges. We know that the cost of operating schools continue to increase as a result of inflation, as a result of absenteeism and vacant positions, as a result of increases in utilities, and as we talked about with the top-up funding, an increase in excess capacity. So again, as our number of students decreases, our funding decreases, but the spaces that we have to maintain are the same. And I would say that another cost that another thing that impacts the cost of facilities really is aging infrastructure. So we know that if we had a 50-year-old house versus a brand new house, that it's going to cost us more to maintain our house. And schools are no different. So when our average age of our schools is over 60 years, then there's costs associated with maintaining those schools. And as they get older, there are more things that need to be maintained. So funding has not kept up. There have been funding increases, usually about 2% a year in this area, but they have not kept up with the costs, and the current underfunding is about $4.5 million. So the next section is overspending that is within TDSB's control. So the first, and again, this isn't a judgment, this is how much we're funded and this is how much we're spending. And it could be based on our priorities, it could be based on a number of things. So I just want to reiterate that right now is that we are spending, we have a $28 million deficit. So obviously it's not everything on this list that contributes to the deficit. Well, it does help to contribute to the deficit, but it's because of either we're spending more or we're underspending in some areas where we could be spending more if we were to look at some of these areas. So the board receives funding through the Learning Resource Fund for student devices at about $7 per pupil per year, but we're spending about $87 per pupil per year. So it's a $1.7 million annually that we receive in funding, and then $9.7 million annually that we have in expenditures. So therefore, the student device program creates a budget pressure of $8 million. We do receive funding through the Learning Resource Fund for computers, about $30 a student, and it's meant for classroom computer hardware and the associated network costs. And for the purposes of this analysis, we have assumed that this funding is covering network costs and the hardware that's purchased by schools that is outside of the one-to-one device program. Pools. The TDSB owns and operates 65 pools. We have an agreement with the city for 27 of them, and the remainder of them are permitted through our permit department for after hours. We do not receive funding to support the operation of the pools, including maintenance and staffing. There are also significant renewal costs attached to pool ownership, which are not included in this analysis. We're only looking at the operating costs. We have costs associated with operating pools at about 20.9 million, and we receive permit fee revenue and lease revenue from the city in about 9.6 million. So pools are creating a budget pressure for TDSB of about 11.3 million. Permit fees, we do have a policy that says that we should be permitting, and we recognize the importance of using schools as community hubs, but that this should be done on a cost recovery basis. And thank you, trustees. You have approved an increase in permit fees that will move us towards cost recovery. So in the current year, the budget pressure is 3.3 million. This will decrease by 1.5 million next year as a result of the changes made in the permit fees. So as you can see, those decisions are helping us move towards cost recovery and towards a balanced budget. Itinerant music instructors. So some of our schools have itinerant music instructors in grades 5 to 8. These positions are unique to TDSB. There is no direct funding source for itinerant music instructors, and the budget pressure related to IMIs or itinerant music instructors is about 4.2 million. So again, some of this could be funded because paraprofessionals and professionals aren't specific. There are, they need to be allocated to, or they're meant to be allocated for employees that support schools and students directly. But we have not done that allocation in this analysis. Outdoor education, the board receives funding through the Learning Resource Fund for outdoor education in the amount of $2.1 million. In addition, we receive revenues and recoveries for the use of the facilities in the amount of $2.3 million. We have 4 day centers and 5 overnight centers that are owned or leased, and we have a number of staff that work at each of those facilities. Our total cost related to outdoor education is about 9.1 million. Again, these are operating costs. These do not include any of the school renewal or facility renewal costs that are required for these facilities. And there's an extra caveat there in that we are actually not allowed to use our funding on outdoor education facilities and require ministry approval to do so. So, and again, that number and that analysis will be presented to trustees next month. It does, as a result of the funding versus the expenditures, create a budget pressure of $4.7 million. Early years programming, we do provide programming like early on, for example, to students before they enter kindergarten. They are not funded through core education funding. And in a lot of cases, in a lot of other jurisdictions, early on centers, for example, are not run by school boards, but by other agencies. So it is expected that we would run these programs on a cost recovery basis, and the current budget pressure is $500,000. Model Schools is a program that we use that's a strength-based approach aimed at increasing access and opportunities for all students. There is no specific funding for model schools provided in the core education funding and creates a budget pressure of $5.2 million. Again, these could be funded through professional and paraprofessional funding or through the differentiated support allocation, which is the new LOI, or sorry, log grant, but that funding has not been allocated for the purposes of this analysis. Cafeterias. Some TDSB schools have cafeterias, and in the past, most of our schools had cafeterias, and actually commissions were a source of income for schools. And that was the same across the province. But with the increased popularity of food delivery services like Uber Eats, for example, changes in regulation, which impacted the type of food that could be served in cafeterias, the demand decreased significantly and the income earned has decreased significantly. We have really 3 different scenarios when we provide food to students in cafeterias. Some are done by third parties, some are done by board staff, and some are done using school programs like the culinary program to provide the food. But given all of those instances, our current budget pressure is about $900,000. Alternative school staffing supplement, and this is specifically for secondary schools. We are doing an analysis right now of elementary schools there may be additional costs associated with that. But we have low enrollments in some of our secondary alternative schools. And so as we do the teacher allocation, we have had to supplement that allocation in order to support program delivery and supervision. And so that was seen as an amount in the school-based staffing report, and it has created a budget pressure in TDSB of $1.3 million. Coordinators and consultants, and I want to be very, very, very clear. These are subject consultants. These are teachers. It's the name given to them by the ministry. We are not talking about consultants that come in and provide advice to the board. So I just want to state that again. These are teachers. These are people who are subject experts who support curriculum across the board. So we receive funding through the Learning Resource Fund to support consultants, coordinators, and this also includes our centrally assigned principals. We receive funding of $13.7 million. We have an expenditure of $15.7 million, so our current shortfall is $2 million. Then our last line item is our other employees. We employ other staff that support schools directly and students directly. They include food program assistants, our nutrition program liaison officers, and many other unique allocations. And in some cases, these are our legacy positions at the schools, at specific schools. But for all of these instances, there is no specific funding for these positions. The shortfall related to them is $8.7 million. Some of the shortfall, again, I'll go to the paraprofessional and professional funding, but we have not allocated it for the purpose of this analysis. So to that point, I just wanted to provide a couple of reminders related to it. If you total everything here and you look at Appendix A, it totals $389.4 million. Obviously, when our deficit is $28 million, there are other funding sources that we either have not allocated or we are spending using the flexibility provided in the grants in order to fund certain expenditures. When we're looking at it, if we were to try to allocate it, it would be a very challenging exercise. It is not something that we are required to do. The ministry does recognize the flexibility that they provide. And again, we do meet all the limitations that were referred to at the beginning of the document. And the other thing, the other important part of this analysis is that some expenses are included in more than one place. And an example is unfunded statutory benefits, because we've got $43.7 million that is truly unfunded statutory benefits. And then when we look at specific areas, and I'll use mental health supports as an example, most of those mental health supports are staff, and included in the expenditures are salaries and benefits. included in the benefits are statutory benefits. And so therefore, there's an overage there that is part of that $43.7 million. So we have not separated out statutory benefits. It would be a challenging exercise, but it is something that you need to consider when you're looking at these numbers and trying to make sense of these numbers. I want to give you an example related to professionals and paraprofessionals, just because I kept talking about it. If we look at these areas that I said we could use funding from professionals and paraprofessionals to help offset the costs, and these numbers are coming directly from Appendix A. So our school safety, we're overspending by 30.5 million, mental health supports 13.9, and so on, to total 71.3 million. Well, the total funding for professionals and paraprofessionals is $37.7 million. So there's a shortfall there even of 33.6 million. So, and this doesn't even include all of the positions that fall under professionals and paraprofessionals, like our IT technicians that are servicing schools, other central staff that support schools and students directly would be included here. And so therefore, there is I just wanted to highlight, even if we had tried to say that 37.7 supports, and then what's the answer? Do they support school safety? Do they support mental health? Do they support elementary supervision? So it's a really challenging exercise, and that's why it has not been done. But I think it's important for us to recognize this as we're looking at this information. So I know I talked a lot, and I'm sure that there are a lot of questions, but I just wanted to also provide you with some next steps. We will be using this information to do further analysis that will assist us in proposing options to balance on April 30th. And really specifically, we will be looking at any operational efficiencies that will help us. We will be looking at reports that will come to trustees to propose some changes potentially. And we will also use it as we work with the ministry to identify funding challenges that impact TDSB directly. As you heard in our last report, the consultation with the public and with students will take place throughout April, and including a survey. And then the core education funding hopefully will come from the ministry in the next few weeks. That will allow us to calculate our actual revenue and see if there are any surprises, hopefully positive surprises, that are included in the core education funding. Although I will remind trustees that when we did the planning and got information from the ministry, they indicated that we should plan for no significant changes. So that's what we have done to create our financial position. So with that, I will stop and turn it back to the chair for any questions, comments. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank the Associate Director, Executive Officer, the entire team for a very detailed report. Lots of great information in here. Before we determine how to continue, at the moment, I only have one person on the speakers list, which surprises me a little bit, but we are going to make a determination as to whether we're going to break or like if we only have one round of questions, then we're going to run through this and conclude. But so I'm going to ask trustees online that if it's your intention to ask questions, could you please indicate so in the chat, and we'll make a determination about whether it's appropriate or not to break. Okay, we're getting a couple. It's 7 minutes, so we're going to take a recess, and we will reconvene at 6:10 for everybody. 7:10. Sorry, my fault. I'm still in the daylight saving thing. Yeah. Anyway, 7:10. We will reconvene at 7:10. We'll be in recess until then. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I should offer to sing is what's being suggested. You clearly didn't go to our retreat. Because nobody who went to our retreat is remotely suggesting that. Okay, Trustee Laskin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate staff's presentation and the slide deck. A couple of questions. Have we completely forgotten the government owes us money for COVID? I don't see that here in unfunded. Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And through the chair. So we were looking at expenditures and I just briefly mentioned it when we're talking about our reserves. So if we hadn't used funding or reserves for COVID, we would have an additional $70 million.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to staff, I think we should be still including that very clearly because there's our deficit. So I really believe that we should not be forgetting that, and that should continue to be part of the conversation. Thank you for that. Number two, I'm three areas. There is, in my mind, a correlation between special education and supply costs. I have been concerned for a long time that we do not have enough supports to make the inclusionary model in our elementary schools especially work. And I'm talking most specifically kindergartens, grade 1 to 3. I believe that, I firmly believe in the inclusionary model. I want to state that out front.
Yeah, I mean,
but I don't believe the inclusionary model works with the number of kids that have been identified in a particular classroom with a teacher and a support staff who is not there on a regular basis. And I really believe that part of teacher burnout can be correlated. So in my mind, if we spent more money on supports to ensure successful inclusion, we would be spending less money on the other side with supply costs. So my question for staff through you, Mr. Chair, is has there ever been any analysis done on that through SEAC in terms of how many is enough in terms of their mind? For example, if there are in a K to 3 cohort, there might be 10 kids that are identified with IPRCs. They are split amongst a number of classrooms. Would you need 2 supports in the school to support 4 teachers? Would you need 3 hours a day? Would you need 6? Has there ever been any modeling done, number one? And number two is, even if we wanted to hire hypothetically another 50, I'm making this up, are they available? Because the wages are not really, they're of a concern. The DECE wages are of a concern too. It's like the people that we trust with our most vulnerable kids are paid the least in our system, in a sense. So I guess I'm just really asking about that because it's in my experience, it is the people in the building that make the difference for the kids in the building. And I'm worried about that, and I might run out of time, so I'm going to do my next question because I don't need answers today, but these are the things I'm thinking about. And then my next question again on supply costs and actually staffing in general. So I know staffing is happening now in the schools, and it's always bothered me. Because of seniority, we lose some of our most dynamic teachers because there's a name on a list that's on leave and has been on leave for multiple years, but continues to be on leave, which means some of your young dynamic teachers who ingratiate themselves to the community get surplused. Those people on leave don't come back. And in September, those principals are scrambling to replace that beloved teacher that's been surplused. And I'm wondering if it's anything that we've ever tackled, or are we able to double bank and not have a school remove those teachers right away just because there's a name on a list? That's a question I have, because I've seen it happen too many times. And then in my 11 seconds from an occasional list, can we be more stringent in terms of if people don't work so many days within a certain period of time, they're off the list, and we actually have people on the list that want to work? So I know my time is up, Mr. Chair, but those are some of my thoughts in trying to get my head around what we might do and what we might not do. And can you put me back on the list, please?
I can. Were you just sharing, or were you looking for responses?
Well, I think staff wanted us just to share. I don't think they wanted us, I don't think they wanted to be put in a position to have to answer right away. Thank you.
Okay. Trustee Earhart, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. And thank you so far for the comments, other trustees. I look forward to hearing what my other trustee colleagues have to share here as well. I'm going to go, I was wondering if staff could go through slide 44 again, the example related to professionals and paraprofessionals. Just over the break, I really, I wanted to make sure I had a clear understanding of that example and the message from that, if possible. Thank you. And that was the example related to professionals and paraprofessionals. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm just, I had logged out of the meeting, so I'm going to log back in and then I will share the slide. So pardon me, but what I will say is that the slide specifically refers to the unfunded amounts that are on the Appendix A. So for example, if you look at school safety has $5.2 million in funding, but the spending is significantly higher. And so at the end, when we look at specific funding to the expenses, we have overspent in that area by $30.5 million. But when we look at $30.5 million, sorry? Oh, it's slide 44, right? That's the slide that Trustee Earhart was referring to. And again, I apologize. Can't, okay. So we're overspent. What the appendix says is that we've overspent by $30.5 million on school safety. But what I indicated is that we do receive other grants that have a component that can be used for school safety. And one of the examples is the professionals and paraprofessional line. And so, but we didn't go through and take that $37.7 million that we receive in funding for professionals and paraprofessionals and say, you know, $1 million is for this and $2 million is for this, because we don't actually do that. And what this slide shows is that even if we look at all of the areas where we could use that funding, in just on that slide alone, it totals $71.3 million, but the funding is only $37.7 million. So there is still a shortfall related to professionals and paraprofessionals just on that list. And there are still many other professionals and paraprofessionals that are not included on the list. It shows a shortfall of $33.6 million. So it was more to tie into, it's really gray on how we've been allocating. And we know that we receive other grants that support school safety, that support mental health supports, that support some of our other staff, but there is no specific funding related to them. So we're using the flexible funding that we have in order to fund those budget line items. And even if we were to try to do the allocation, like I say, for professionals and paraprofessionals, we're still overspent. So I guess my point was, so we're overspent by $33.6 million. Just if we just use those 6 areas as an example, or 5 areas as an example, where do I allocate that $33.6 million? Is it all school safety? Is some of it mental health? Is some of it itinerant music? So we didn't try to do that allocation, nor would we, I think, be able to do that allocation. I hope that helps. It is very complicated, but what I tried to show is that even if I had tried to do an allocation, we would still be overspent.
That would be fine. That would be fine.
Okay, thank you very much through the chair. For me, that was very helpful. It helped me to understand how in some areas we have flexible funding, but speaking as a parent, in addition to being a trustee, you know, mental health supports as a clear category are important to me. And I imagine they're important to many parents across the province because of how important that is to serve our children. And so what I would be interested in is if there are some categories where we may be putting it, say, professionals and paraprofessionals into mental health supports, where we're using our flexible funding to fund buckets that parents across the province, I believe, would support the advocacy for it to be funded more by the province to all school boards, not just TDSB. I'm hopeful that we can engage with our partner school boards at all levels in that advocacy. I hope that makes sense. Some around this table would have a better sense about what those categories are, just looking at that list. Music sounds very important too, as someone who a lover of music. Mental health, school safety. I hope we can continue to do that partnership. I'll move on to another question that I had too within the report under school administration. This was the first time I had seen before that that TDSB is spending more than we are allocated in this area. I recognize and have moved motions to maintain our funding, but that the benchmark salaries for clerical staff are approximately $18,000 per employee lower than the actual cost, and that there's no funding in the core ed for sick paid leaves for these employees. And I just want to clarify, these employees is in reference to principals and vice principals and clerical staff. Is that all 3 categories? Thank you.
Through the chair, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. I find that very surprising and disheartening. Does core education allow for sick and paid leaves for other employees that is expected that school boards would have? Thank you.
So through the chair, we did allocate the supply costs for teachers and ECEs or DECEs because we do receive funding specific to those areas. In the past, and I think this was identified when we brought forward financial facts as well, with the change from the GSN to the core education, in order to simplify it, they actually got rid of a lot of the little individual allocations, and it's more of a group allocation. So it is harder for us to understand if there is still remaining funding in there that is meant to offset supply costs. So that's why we only looked at the supply costs for teachers and DECEs, because that's the only, and even for teachers, it's only classroom teachers, right? We have other teachers like ESL teachers, like French teachers that are supported through those grants that don't have a breakdown of the supply costs included there. But we do know for a fact that there is nowhere in the grants that supports the paid leave for school administration.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think that's an important gap. I'd be curious to know how much of our funding shortfall is related to costs associated with that versus how many principals and vice principals we've allocated in schools. I'm not sure if one can make that comparison, but it's something I would be interested in learning. Thank you.
Thank you. And through the chair, I'm not sure, Trustee, I heard if you saw about on page 22 of the slides, it does show a breakdown of the $35.4 million.
Okay, thank you very much. And then just last bit with my time, just the appendix, the summary of unfunded, underfunded, overspent areas of the budget. To me, gave me real pause. The areas within the control of the TDSB sits at 50 million. And my observation is many of those support student well-being and achievement. But even if all of them were removed just from a very technocratic perspective, we still wouldn't make up the funding shortfall. Whereas the areas that are not within our control total well over and are things not, they're more structural policy costs. They're not as directly related to student achievement, although movements on things like the excess capacity where students could be offered more choice through the lifting of moratorium would contribute, the actual lifting would both assist our bottom line and contribute to student achievement. It gave me real pause. And then 226 partially within the control of the TDSB. I'm curious what if we're hearing from other boards. I certainly see in the media that they are also, many boards seem to be experiencing funding shortfalls. Do we have a sense if their makeups are similar? And so some of them are unique to Toronto, but are some of these shortfalls being experienced more generally province-wide? Thanks very much.
Through the chair, there are definitely challenges that are board-wide challenges, and I will use statutory benefits as an example, and not even within school boards, but also in other government-funded areas like colleges and universities, hospitals, where the funding has not kept up with the costs. And there are some, like excess capacity, which would impact some boards, but not others, but certainly not, maybe a little bit more pronounced in TDSB. Excess spaces of 63,000. I bet you there's not very many boards that have 63,000 students total. So we could move their boards into TDSB. But there are definitely unique challenges, and this analysis will certainly help staff to have those conversations with the ministry, which was directed and agreed to by both TDSB and the ministry through the Auditor General report.
Okay, thank you. I may have more questions after, but I sincerely appreciate staff time on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Earhart. Trustee King.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Thank you to staff for both the report and the presentation. I found them both very helpful in following and understanding very complex information. I'm jumping ahead with a question about the next steps, but it does relate to a point that Trustee Earhart made earlier on in her time. With consultations with the public happening before the presentation of options to balance the budget, I believe that Associate Director Zucker mentioned that what you hear through the consultations will help inform your analysis. And I'm wondering if we can hear more from you about how the consultations with the public will be framed and to what end. I'm wondering if they are meant to be more of a budget 101, setting the context and general Q&A, or are you looking to dive directly into the areas that we're looking at today, the underfunded, overspended areas? And can we expect a presentation kind of similar to this? Are you looking for general feedback and comment the way we do in delegations? Or is there going to be a certain framing or prompting or questions to help elicit insights that are helpful for your process? So, we heard Trustee Earhart earlier, ask about themes, and I think that's what I'm getting at. Are you looking to prompt or derive some kind of themes or drivers And I think more to the point, how do we avoid that process just being a chorus of folks singing about what they don't want to get cut because that will be everything. Nobody wants to lose pools, nobody wants to move model schools. How does that process become helpful for you and for us as decision makers?
Thank you through the chair. Thank you, Trustee King. Those are all really important considerations as we develop the presentation for sure, and how do we focus the presentation in order to get the best feedback that we can from the public in order to assist us in helping to make decisions. So I think it's a little bit of everything that you mentioned, and it really is then how much do we need to go into detail, because we want to make sure that there is an understanding of the challenges that we have in as you referred to the budget 101. I think that that's sort of an important context setting piece. To also look at these unfunded areas, but then how do we focus the direction of those consultations in order to make it as informative as possible. So those are things that we will be taking into consideration as we develop the presentation.
Thank you. And as a follow-up, I think that there's a prompt for my colleagues as well for us to think about the opportunity that presents in terms of areas of advocacy and what we hear and how that may focus our work as well. Thank you. That's all for me.
Thank you, Trustee King. Trustee Earhart, are you available?
I am, if there was no one else.
No, that's not what I had in mind. I'm going to pass the chair to you.
Okay, yes, certainly. Please go ahead, Chair.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair, and again, want to thank staff for all the work that went into this. I was moved by the optimism around the positive surprises you're looking forward to in the core funding announcement. So that was an optimistic note that I don't think we should let slide. And given Trustee Laskin's position about positions and versus questions, I'm going to try to frame this not in question form, but sharing that found it a little confusing. We referenced the transportation and the lack of funding around the transportation of students accessing special education programming. And it wasn't as clear to me whether that tied in to the overall transportation budget or not. There was a shortfall. There was a mention of with the French immersion, what that reference was. And we talked about, but we didn't talk about whether it actually was factored into that line or not, or it was actually a shortfall somewhere else. So I just thought I'd share that. I do want to echo, and again, through you, Madam Chair, Trustee Laskin's, I've always had a great deal of challenge with central, when we have staff in central positions, and their positions are held for them in their schools. And because we don't approve, traditionally, we don't approve those positions until the end when we're tying the whole process up with a bow, because that we're done. As a result, we end up having to send notification letters the 1st of May, I think is roughly when those letters go out. And I would like us to consider, when we talk about those positions and determine in this budget process around at what point trustees are willing to talk about that. And if that's not a cut we're willing to make, if we made that determination in April, we wouldn't have to hold those positions, and we wouldn't have to put the cascade of the ramifications for that wouldn't take place. So I would like, if at all possible, for us to think about presenting that particular piece to trustees in a manner that we might settle. We won't have the ability at that point to complete the process or anything, but that small component of it we may be able to settle and would alleviate a whole lot of negative ramifications that happen in our buildings. Trustee Laskin referenced teacher. There's all kinds of teachers in our buildings. When I go on school visits, they're all dying to keep the person that's first going to get sent out, because they got great enthusiasm. They're doing tremendous work in their buildings, and they end up being a big casualty to this process, not because we're going to lose them, but we're just going to lose this process, and the manner in which we do it means we lose them where they are. So, we will replace them in September, but quite often we replace them with someone different who's got to start again. And every time, from that employee's perspective, they start losing their momentum if every time they got to go to a building, they have to start again. And so I would hope that we would look at trying to have that small piece of the conversation in a time frame that trustees may or may not. We may, I don't want to speak on behalf of the committee or the board, but I do think that there's an opportunity to look at that time frame and address that in a way that would be, from the system's point of view, more beneficial. I'm not the chair, so I can't give you the floor. Trustee Earhart, the director's looking to.
You have the floor, Director.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, appreciate the question and the positioning, Trustee McLean, and I think that that's really good feedback, along with the question that Trustee Laskin asked, for us to take back and consider in our staffing process to see what may be possible, keeping in mind that along with the desire to have the least disruption in schools and to create the greatest stability for the school staff, for the individuals impacted. And I know we're talking in many cases about those that are least senior in any particular school. We also have to consider collective agreement, requirements around how the staffing process works. And so I think allocation is a part of that, which is certainly connected to the budget question that we're talking about now and will for the next little while. They're the significant operational aspect to that work as well. So I think there's some key learnings as we work through this staffing season and this budget process as well, for us to then consider implication for the next cycle. And so these are all things that staff are in the process of taking a look at now, and to see what may be possible going forward. So I appreciate your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Director. And with that, Trustee Earhart, I've concluded, so I'll take the chair back. Thank you. And I'll reach out to trustees before we start round two. Are there any trustees that have questions? That hearing and seeing none. Trustee Laskin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up with the comment the director made, maybe we just have to increase the holdback and carry a liability until reorganization the last week of September, so we can double bank in some schools against positions. That's just a thought. I'm not a staffing expert. The other thing, through you, Mr. Chair, to staff, that I think is completely missing from this report is inflation. We completely leave that out in terms of unfunded or overfunded. And I think we've missed an opportunity there because, again, the OPSPA data, I know it's provincial data, but it talks about the growing gap in public education, 776 decrease in per pupil funding from 2018, 2019 until today. So I think inflation in real dollar terms, we should also be including as underfunding of the system, frankly. So, and I think, and if I use creative license, I would make a budget that has over $44 million to spend more. In fact, I add back the COVID, that's another 63, but I wouldn't add it to spending. I would put it back in reserves. I would put the inflationary money back in reserves, but I would have $44 million to spend on programs and services and additional supports for kids if the province just paid what they owe us in real dollar terms. So I actually, you know, I know that's a pipe dream, but I think that positioning, I think, is important to have the data about. So I wanted to take that opportunity to mention. Sorry, you've moved your mic down, so I think you want to say something.
No, thank you through the chair and appreciate that. And I'm just wondering through the chair to Ms. Joseph Dowers, if maybe we can add that line and update the chart before it goes to board, because appreciate that feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's great because it's just here for information. I think you are able to, frankly, you know, put an amended report in our package for board. But again, I'm not governance staff either. The other piece that I'm really wondering about is this concept of overspending. I mean, I think if you pretty much talk to any parent in the system, especially a parent that has a child with special needs, they would say we're not spending enough. So I know we're spending more than the money the province gives us, but I don't think it's overspending. I actually think it's spending to a critical need, and there could still be more spending. So I just share that because overspending somehow means we're doing something wrong. And maybe from the ministry's perspective, we are, but from my perspective, when one of my duties is the safety and security and the academic achievement and the well-being of all students within our care, I would argue there are things we're not spending enough on. And one of those things is the cuts to central staff that we've made through the years. And one of the reports we did ask for through the budget, through that staffing special meeting, was the director to bring us back a report. It probably won't be in time for this year's process. I understand that. But I really think we have to look at our system, the supports our principals need, the supports our teachers need in this ever-changing environment that we're in. And I'm really worried, and it really triggered me when we're missing those Massey Hall concerts that even went on during World War II. And we're missing them because I've been told we don't have central staff that can coordinate them. Our kids are missing those opportunities because we don't have central staff that can coordinate the all-city bands, the all-city orchestras, the performances that used to happen at Massey Hall, which were highlights not only of the kids, but of the parents who remember being in those concerts when they were the students in the TDSB. And it just, even when Massey Hall was being rebuilt, we moved it to Roy Thompson Hall. Then COVID hit and they've never come back. And the reason I was given for why they never come back is we no longer have central staff that can help coordinate that. I have to accept that as an answer, but I'm sure I could put the call out to retired music teachers to help support bringing those concerts back. But there are things that we don't do because of funding pressures that make such a difference in the lives of our students that it just makes me sad. Anyway, those were really just my general comments. And lastly, in my 2 seconds, I just, when you meet with the minister's staff about the Auditor General, will you please report back to us in terms of our priorities, their priorities, and if there's any way to meet in the middle? Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for the indulgence of going over time.
Thank you, Trustee Laskin. Trustee Earhart.
Thank you. And also thank you for all of the comments and questions to date, other trustees. I also had wanted to flag inflation as something to be thinking about, as when we had discussed the deficit in previous meetings, it was my understanding that a significant component of what we're considering deficit is related to the cost of the same things going up, including in facilities and transportation. And so I think that's an important thing to continually bring out, because that is something that it goes beyond our board, in which it would be reasonable for governments to support in unprecedented economic circumstances. And so while there are some things that would require us to work together for unique pilots, for policy or regulatory changes to facilitate, to bring our board to make our board whole, so to speak. There are some that are reasonable for the across the education sector at this particular moment in history as well, because we are facing unprecedented existential economic risks. And I am hopeful that a government will be considering broad-based supports as our society faces these risks, right? And our public institutions form essential components of what make us a wonderful city, province, country. And so I'm very hopeful that that will be considered, and I want us to be positioned for that as well. So I wanted to make that known. I also wanted to flag, I wanted to ask again, just the lines around coordinators and consultants. I heard a verbal description, but in the charts, the word consultant and coordination, it can be misleading. It can sometimes be assumed to be without merit on some occasions. And I would not be a person that would typically make that pronouncement, but it has been flagged to me by constituents. And so I would want clarification on how these roles serve student well-being and achievement. My understanding from the description in the text is that it supports teacher program consultants and centrally assigned principals. And my understanding from past briefings is that these range from to achieve student outcomes that we are seeking in areas like math and reading, early reading. So I'm hoping that staff could elaborate on that and might consider footnoting within materials in the appendix in particular, just a bit more clarification on the role. And I'd love a response to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And through the chair, we can certainly add more detail in future communication to trustees and board reports. Trustee Earhart, our consultants are a very important part of our program delivery and support our administrators and teachers in differentiating learning experiences for students, unpacking the curriculum and making decisions in regards to their pedagogical approach. I could go on, definitely, but I think what we'll do is take your suggestion of the footnote and expand on the importance of what our consultants and coordinators do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Does that conclude your questions, Trustee Earhart? You have time. I'm just.
No, I think I had just one last bit, because the way we have things grouped are not within control, partially within control, which I know as trustees is one helpful way for us to see it. I'm thinking in terms of our relationship with the province. It may also be helpful to have things grouped by, I don't know, by elements that are contributing to student well-being and achievement, and also potentially elements that would require provincial policies the provincial changes to enact, right? Either through pilot or a unique agreement with the City of Toronto or with the TDSB, I'm thinking. So I'd appreciate some thinking there, and I'm curious if we have sufficient board direction for any of that advocacy. It would seem to me that several of the elements we've already passed advocacy motions before. So I would be interested from staff if there's any areas where we're identifying funding gaps where there's insufficient board direction to proceed with discussions with the province. And thank you.
Yeah, through the chair, Trustee Earhart, we hear your request. We can relook at how we could even further classify these areas. And I don't think it requires further direction. I think there's an understanding of what you're looking for. And again, we can look at providing more information possibly in time for the board meeting.
Thank you. And I would wonder if, knowing that some of those areas could take time at the province to achieve, should there be successful dialogue on change in that area? And so any kind of transitional support that could be offered given the contribution of those areas to the deficit, to the structural deficit. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee. And I love the optimism in the room. It's not anymore that we don't think our advocacy is going to be successful. It's the time it's going to take them to act on the successful I'd like just the whole concept of that is just worth noting. So thank you, Trustee Earhart. And with that, and no other speakers on the list, this is for receipt. I need a mover and seconder for receipt. Trustee Hassan is happy to move. I need a seconder.
Trustee Earhart can begrudgingly second.
Trustee Earhart seconds. Can we open the vote, please?
Hassan in favor.
McLean in favor.
Shan in favor.
Trustee Lee, can you share how you vote?
In favor.
Trustee Lee's in favor. Thank you, sir. No. Please, Trustee Rajwani absent. And that passes. Thank you. And the only in your blue folder tonight, there was a notice of motion. We got a commercial earlier in the evening from Trustee Earhart pertaining to the understanding impacts of U.S. policies and responses on the TDSB and its responses. And with that, I need a mover and seconder for adjournment. This should be easier to come by. Trustee Hassan will move.
Trustee Earhart will second.
Trustee Earhart will second, and not reluctantly this time, so that's good. All in favor? Opposed, if any? We're adjourned. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions and your attention and the contribution. Have a good night.
Thank you.